Hello and welcome to the PTFN Trust Amendment presentation. This is being brought to you by myself, Chris Wilson. Originally the plan was to have a community meeting to share this information in person with the members and also have a bit of a video stream with some other presentations, but unfortunately, as we all know, COVID has once again intervened in our lives. And we're going to do this virtually because that's the only option that's available to us. So we'll be running through a few slides of various information items that we think you need and hope this is what you need. But if you need more information, you can always reach out to us. So without further ado, I will start and we'll get into the presentation. The first slide that I will speak to is an overview of the PTFN Trust. The trust agreement itself was part of the Treaty Land Entitlement Settlement Agreement that PTFN agreed to back in 2010. The trust agreement itself was one of the documents that was noted on the ballot that each adult member in the Peerless community and trust community voted on as part of that settlement in 2010. The trust itself is a 22-page document. There are 14 sections in it, and it includes a number of different instructions and directions, and it creates a control framework on how the trust will be managed. And the trust itself is the funds that the Peerless Trout First Nation received as part of the 2010 settlement. As I mentioned, the terms and conditions of the trust are quite extensive. There are 14 sections, including a definition section. It describes how money is to be invested. It describes how money is to be expended. Section 6 of the trust is one that describes how votes are to be conducted with the beneficiaries to establish the programs and services that are offered within the PTFN communities for the benefit of the nation's members. There are 3 sections that describe the qualifications and obligations of the trustees, their duties as trustees, and their powers and authorities. One of the other sections of the trust that's quite important is section 11 of the trust, and that talks about how the trust can be amended. And that's what this entire process is about. So the next slide that I'll speak to is titled Amending the Trust Agreement. The first question we've been asked by many people is, can the PTFN Trust be changed, amended? And the answer to that is yes. There is a clause in the trust that deals with amendment. It's section 11 of the document. But there are some very clear things that you cannot do when you amend the trust. First and foremost of those is we cannot change who are the beneficiaries of the trust. And the beneficiaries is a defined term in the document, and it means all current and future members of the Peerless Trout First Nation. The other thing that is clearly outlined in the trust with respect to amendments is the trust itself cannot be cancelled. At no point can this document be just simply cancelled. It is one of the founding governance documents of the nation, and as soon as a member of council is elected, they are by default a trustee, and they are bound by the rules of the trust. As I mentioned, the trust can be amended through a voting process that would involve all voting beneficiaries, those members who are 18 years of age and older. Everyone should come out and vote on these amendments, and the amendments would be approved if a majority of those people who voted approved the amendment. The next slide I'll speak to is titled Why Amend the Trust Agreement. The trustees have wanted to make changes for some time, and they did analyze a few different approaches and options on how to amend the trust. 3 objectives were identified for this process, and the first of those was to increase the value of the trust by eliminating the trust loans. The value of our trust has diminished since 2015, the year the very first trust loan was issued. In 2015, the value of the trust was $63 million. And bear in mind, we started in about 2012 was when the trust was fully funded by the settlement funds. And at that point, there was approximately $52 million in the trust. So between 2012 and 2015, the trust grew to 63 million and change. In 2015, that was the very first year that a trust loan was issued as an authorized investment under the trust. And a little later in the presentation, I will give you the details from the trust audits to show you how between 2015 and now 2021, the value of the trust has gone down. So that was the first objective that the trustees wanted to ensure. The second objective was to increase the income to the trust and ensure that trust programs and services could be administered. As some of you know from previous presentations, the trust programs can only be provided if there is income from the trust based on the audit that is done at the end of every year. 50% of any income that is earned in the trust is available for the delivery of programs and services in the community. And as some of you probably are aware, there's over a dozen trust programs that offer up to almost $800,000 of different programs and services in the community. But those programs and services can only be delivered if there is income to the trust. And unfortunately, in 3 or 4 of the last 5 years, there have been no trust programs because there was no income to the trust, or there has been a reduced level of trust programs and services. So the second goal that was an objective of this process was to ensure that trust programs are available and also try to increase those programs, because if we grow the trust and there's more income, then more programs and services can be offered to you as beneficiaries. The final goal of this amendment process is to define the term majority. Unfortunately, that particular word, majority, is not defined anywhere in the 22 pages of the trust document. And to avoid any issues or concerns, that is another objective of this document. We want a clearly defined term for the word. The next slide I will speak to is about trust loans themselves and the background. This slide shows you a pie chart that summarizes the $22 million of trust loans that have sadly and unfortunately been written off over the last 5 years. Each section of the pie shows you the amount of money that was written off for one specific loan, whether that involved Peerless Trout Enterprises, PTFN Concrete, PT Logging, DCR Incorporated, which was a logging operation, or Deb Kerr Holdings. Those loans all have been written off completely, and the total loss to the nation's trust is $22 million. Continuing with the background on trust loans, this next graphic shows you 2 different charts. The one on the left is a line chart that shows the income to the trust from 2012 to the most recent trust audit that was completed for the year ended 2020. And the bar chart on the right shows the amount of loans that were written off over each of the last 5 audits. So starting with the audited net income chart on the left-hand side, the line chart, you can see the history, as I mentioned, over the last 8 years. From 2012 to 2015, you can see that there was varying amounts of income and things were performing quite well up until that time. In 2015, that was the very first time a trust loan was issued. And as you can see, between that timeline around 2016 and 2020, there were 4 out of those 5 years where the trust had no income. And as a result, no trust programs and services were funded by the trust during those years. There was at times some trust programs offered, but the programs were funded by other sources of income that the nation had. This graphic is really presented to show to you the impact of how when funds are written off from a trust loan, it has a significant impact on the income to the trust, which in turn means there are no programs and services, and the ability for the trust to grow is severely compromised and taken away. The bar chart on the right-hand side of this graphic just outlines the amount of money that was written off as a result of trust loan losses over the last 5 years. And the worst year was 2017, where $7.2 million was written off. But as you can see, it's been a very difficult 5 years, and it's all as a result of the trust loan losses. The final slide that I'll speak to today as part of the presentation is this graphic that has a green line piece of information and a bar chart along the bottom. So first of all those gold bars at the bottom of this slide are a representation of the actual audit values from the audits that have been completed by Doyle & Company starting in 2011 all the way through to 2021. And as you can see, the trust increased in value from 2011 through 2014 when the trust reached its maximum value ever of just over 64 million. And if you go all the way to the far right, you can see that the current value of the audit based on the latest information we have from Scotia Wealth is $54 million. So you can see that between 2014 and today in 2021, the trust has lost, unfortunately, about $10 million. And as I've mentioned in the previous two slides and shown the information from the previous two slides, those losses are directly attributed to trust loan losses. The green line in this graphic is an analysis that the team completed to try and determine what the trust would have been worth if no trust loans had ever been issued from the trust. And we worked from the audited trust values and we pulled out any amounts that were removed from the trust for loans, and we also added back in interest would have been earned based on the assumption that the money would have been left with Scotia Wealth. And we have very accurate information on the rate of return that Scotia Wealth has generated from the very start. And that amount is 5.72% per year. So when you carry out that analysis, the numbers that are generated are those points noted by the green line. And as you can see, the analysis has determined that if the trust loans had never been issued, the PTFN trust would currently be worth $101 million, substantially more than where we currently sit. And this graphic just shows how devastating the trust loans have been for the trust. And all this information, as I've pointed out, is brought to you to demonstrate the need for the changes that are outlined in the amendments of this trust.